So I'm George Carillet, president and founder of Teaching Ministries International. My wife and I have been married this summer 55 years, and 37 of those years we spent overseas. By the time I was 16, I'd already lived 10 years overseas because my father liked overseas duty, and he was in the U.S. Air Force. My wife, on the other hand, had never left Brevard County, the county of her birth, until she struggled against everything to go to Atlanta Christian College and launch out on her own. And a year later, we got married. So we've been partners in this ministry all these years. After we both graduated from college and graduate school, we went to survey the work behind the Iron Curtain in 1971. And we were there till the end of 75, where I was the director of the, at the time called Toronto Christian Mission, now called TCM, or Taking Christ to the Millions, Evangelism Center in Vienna, Austria, the Vienna Woods of Austria. And Joel was born there. We returned to the US, but he could no longer conveniently travel with us, and because we worked in all the Eastern European countries. And we went to Snellville, a suburb of Atlanta, Georgia, where I served for 9 years. During that time, I was 5 years on the board of Pioneer Bible Translators, and they sent me to do some reconciliation work with 2 missions in Zaire, now known as Republic of Congo. And then later they sent me also on some policy issues to Papua New Guinea, the island north of Australia. And there they asked if we would return, where I would serve as director and exegetical consultant, Bible consultant. And we did. We were there for 8 years, except for a furlough to take Joel to go to a real school in the US for a senior year, the school he would have graduated from if we had stayed in the US. And then he went off to college. We did that later with our daughter Tiffany, gave her a senior year of American high school, and then off to college. We'd always thought that we'd return to work in East Europe someday when we didn't have children, and so that day had come. And after doing a survey in Eastern Europe, we determined to become a part of a new college, Crimean American College, partnership between the school in Crimea and Kentucky Christian University. And eventually, I became president as well as founder of the Biblical Studies Institute, and they offered a minor in business, but our majors were English and German for translators and teachers. When Putin came in 2014, we got booted out. And I continued working there 3 times a year from the US until it became illegal to do so. And then finally we sold one property there that was our outreach center, but our college building itself was taken by friends of the new prime minister of Crimea. So for 5 years, 6 years now, we've been in the US, and most of my ministry now is teaching overseas, primarily in Ukraine, where I teach at seminaries. I taught at 6, maybe 7 seminaries now. And I also do work in Cuba with the disciple making movement, and was supposed to have been in Haiti and Dominican Republic recently, but decided I needed to stay home. So that's the background. And what I'm doing in telling my stories is recapturing and recording some of the key events and things that I recollect from 71 onward. And all of these things speak to how God has worked in our lives. We are college educated people, but otherwise average, normal. But we heard the call, and I'm writing a chapter for a book. It's due the 15th of this month on our call to ministry, our call to missions. But since we went to 3 different mission fields at 3 different times, I'll use up all of my allotment of words for that chapter. So what I was going to talk about today, last time, so I've done a video presentation of our last ministry in Crimea. I did a PowerPoint of our previous ministry in Crimea before Russia came in. And now I've been telling stories from the 70s. Last time it was about Czech Republic. This time it's about Poland. And I just have 3 very short stories, and we'll call it a day.
I'm still here.
I'm checking. Okay, let's start with when we went over there in 71, we were often in villages that had never seen a foreigner because it was still, they had been under the Soviet Union for all those years. And we were there before independence came from the Soviet Union. So we were involved in what some used to call those days a behind the Iron Curtain ministry. We had a number of contacts that we were following up in each one of these places. And we would ask the people, we've been invited to return here and settle in Vienna and work in East Europe. Is it important to you that we do that? And don't please an American with saying what he wants to hear. And so that's part of what we were doing in 1971 in East Europe before moving there in 72. And like I said, in many places, nobody had ever seen a foreigner before. We traveled on a tourist visa and slept in a Volkswagen camper. Some of our work took us to cities, but a lot of them were to villages and small towns where there were still active churches, legal churches, though many of the pastors I spoke to had already had their stint in prison from an earlier period when there was more persecution. So going out to East Poland, we were in very rural areas, and we attracted a crowd wherever we went. There were not that many church buildings because they hadn't been permitted, but they often had a license to use a house for church gatherings. And so they had that permission. And so we were often in houses or very small church buildings, no steeple or anything like that. They didn't look like ours. And we always had overflow crowds in those days. So curiosity brought people out by the droves. And so we would be inside of a house speaking, and people would be hanging out on the balcony. They'd be out in the yard. And so it was an exciting time to know that we were sharing the good news and teaching from scriptures at a place that they hadn't had this opportunity. And we were not, it wasn't legal for us to preach or teach, but there was a device used in those days called bringing greetings. And so someone would say, well, we're glad to have some Americans visiting. And in the summer, I used interns, so there'd be a whole group of us, five to seven of us. So we're glad to have Americans with us, and they are going to bring you greetings. So I would say, well, I bring you greetings from the United States of America, particularly from the state of Florida. And I belong to a church there in a place called O'Galley, Florida. And those people told me to be sure to bring you greetings. And so I'm extending greetings, and they wanted me to greet you with the scriptures too, with the word of God. So I'm going to read from some scripture here and make some comment about it. So basically, that's how I preached in those early days. And often going from one place to the other. My wife was changing clothes from traveling clothes to church clothes in the back of the van. She learned to do a lot of things with just a Dixie cup, either an empty cup or a full cup. I shaved out of a cup of water. So we sometimes made jokes about, do we have enough Dixie cups for this trip? In case those of you don't know, they were just, in those days, just small. None of these big solo cups. They were just small, like coffee size. So it was exciting. Many people came out wherever we went. And to know, again, that we were given something to them fresh, we had no doubt that after our survey trip, we would return. There was a place for us. Well, that's not true for me to say we had no doubt. My wife understood why we should go back, why I wanted to go back. But again, except for college, she never left the county. And we'll skip that story. That'll be in my chapter. But in the end, we both agreed that the Lord wanted us to go there. So along with our adventures in East Poland, there was traveling off-road. These were roads. They were just the ones made by wagons. And when it rained, it was rather perilous, lots of mud. They had a lot of black dirt there. And the nationals would tell me, oh, you can go there. You can go this way to that village. You don't have to go to the highway. You know, you can go there. And we were game. And so one time we were dragging so much in the mud that the pipe that went underneath the vehicle that drained the sink was ripped off. And so we took that muddy thing and put it in the van. We kept going until finally the mud was just plain too deep for that Volkswagen. And so we called for a tow. So a farmer came out with 2 horses and connected to us. And there we were, moving across this muddy terrain, being pulled by 2 horses. I know I have some pictures someplace, but some of these photos I'll have to, when I don't have other things pressing me, I'll have to see if I have them somewhere. There were slides in those days, but some were made into prints. But that's already a long time ago to keep track of them, and lots of moves since then. So that's the story of the church and how it was not a problem to get a crowd, and the story of how our transportation sometimes was over farmland and had to be towed by horses. I think, okay, 2 more stories from Poland. Also in East Poland, there was a river that at points separated Poland from Belarusia, which was also part of Russia. And it was called the Bug River. And one time when I went there to meet with people, the church had people ready for a baptism. Now, for a Florida boy, no, that water was too cold. Glad I wasn't doing the baptism. So people held up sheets while the women changed behind one set of sheets and the men changed behind, or the boys another set. Oh, by the way, it was illegal to baptize anybody who was 18 or under, or maybe under 18. So people were changing and it was cold. And then they were going to be baptized by this man. And I said, well, is he a pastor or somebody? Well, lots of times they didn't have formal pastors, not like we think about them, but they did have elders or church leaders. And so somebody said, well, let me tell you a short story about him. Until very recently, he worked for the KGB. Now, for those who are too young to know, KGB was a notorious agency that only answered to a very small group in the government. But otherwise, they were pretty well freelancers to torture people, kidnap people, and so forth, who they thought was breaking the Soviet law. So this guy had worked for the KGB. He became a Christian, and he said, I can't do that anymore. Lots of times people can't leave the KGB unless it's in a casket. Once KGB, always KGB. They got their hooks in you, you owe them. And they can cause a lot of problems to you, your family, and so forth. So don't cross them. Well, he did. And he was the one doing the baptism that day. So there we were on the border with Belarusia, White Russia, and cold, people ready to go in that water, to that river to be baptized, and a guy doing it ex-KGB. So those were some exciting years, those early years that we were there, 71 to 75. When we left, independence hadn't come yet, and so they were still under communist rule. We participated in a camp called Ostruda, also during that time, and mostly it was in the summers when we would have the interns. And I know I have some pictures where there's this little wooden wall, and there's me and some other guys standing behind the wall, and we have an umbrella over our head. And that wall that we were behind is what, in those days, they used the French word, was called a pissoir. Pissoir. And so it was a urinal, just an outdoor urinal. And so people walked by and thought nothing of it. And the girls did have more privacy, but that's what we had. We had one building that everybody was confined to, or you slept in tents. Most of us slept in tents, or I slept in the camper. And I remember the bonfire. It was a huge bonfire and a nice lake, but it was the very beginnings of the camp. It was somebody's vision to have a camp in a country that had nothing like that. But this person had been to Lincoln Christian College in the US and had returned and was using some American or Western ideas for reaching young people. So we participated in that. I've been back to that camp since then. They have modern buildings, modern facilities, et cetera, et cetera. As I walk around there, I still see that wall, which functioned as a urinal. I still see where instead of buildings, there were the tents. But the bonfire is still in the same place. The dock, probably a new dock, it's in the same place. So I have returned to Poland to preach and teach there, both while I was still under communism and since then. I think that's enough storytelling to give you an idea about how it was in the 70s, carrying the gospel, working as a tourist, uh, but really as a missionary. So we saw God at work in many ways, and among others, just protecting us from the authorities, from accidents on the road with wagons who were improperly lit at night. There weren't very many cars on the roads in those days. If you had the money to buy a car, you had to be on a waiting list. It could take years and years before it was time for you to get a car. Even the people who live in what was the Iron Curtain countries now, most of them, they have to be about as old as me to remember or to know how it was. People start flirting again with socialism and communism when they forget how it was. Well, I think, Michael, I'll call it quits there and turn it back over to you.